Hello, and welcome to Happy Queer Adults.
In this episode, we had the immense pleasure of interviewing my friend and coworker, Talia Simon. Talia talks about their experience as an immigrant on a journey of self-love, gender expression, and queerness, from transitioning to dating all throughout the COVID pandemic. So let's play the interview. Well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Okay, so start by telling us names, pronouns, how you identify, a little bit about who you are, and also how you're doing today.
Okay, so my name is Talia Simon. I'm non-binary and pansexual, and I think those were the key ones. I'm doing pretty good today. I've got a date with a beautiful Colombian man that I'm falling for. It's great, and just going to the farmer's market, so really can't complain.
I also went to the farmer's market this morning and it was lovely.
What'd you get?
I got flowers and I got a bunch of vegetables, which we're going to roast for dinner tonight. Very excited.
Awesome.
Grill, actually.
We're gonna grill them.
So you grew up in a lot of different countries. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like growing up?
Yeah, I think so. My parents are French, but I was born in Italy. So I think for me, there's always this notion of being an immigrant. There was never the alternative. Italy also has a generally, I think, xenophobic foreign policy where if you're born in Italy, but you don't have at least one Italian grandparent, you can't claim citizenship. So immediately, I was born in Italy, but I'm not Italian whatsoever. The biggest thing that my family's taken out of Italy is really the cuisine and some of the culture that we've taken with us. And so it's kind of, I started with a duality there of multicultural identity, moved to Austria. And so by the time I was 5, I was speaking French, Italian, and German, but couldn't really differentiate sometimes. I would use in Italian say la macchina to talk about a car, and I'd say that in French la machine. It just didn't work. And so it was kind of an interesting experience. I didn't come to the US until I was 10. And I think it's interesting because English has now become my first language in a way, just because French is something language I used in school. I talked with my parents, but I never got to that level of I can't talk about things like legal terms. I don't know what a hearing is in French. I'll hear the word and I'll know what it is, but certain surgical things as well. I don't know how to express myself like that. So I think for me, it's always just been this experience of adapting and figuring out how to get through, and also just never really fitting in. And eventually I was very uncomfortable with that growing up, but finding comfort and joy also of just standing out and being your own self and not just being another one of those people. Not to make generalizations, but so yeah, definitely hard when you're young, but so rewarding, I think, now with the perspective it's given me in the world.
So it sounds like you've pretty much been consider yourself to be an immigrant throughout your entire life. What impact do you think that had on you growing up?
I think for me, there was a big struggle that I identify as finding my cultural identity. Mm-hmm. And I think it was really hard for me to, later, I think I realized how it was all tied to gender and who I was, not just cultural, but just identity, period. So much of the messaging that I grew up with, was different versions of masculinity based on the culture there. I came into the US and I already stood out, even though I presented quote unquote masculine at the time. I was just this little awkward boy. And immediately, because I was French, I was kind of labeled as little gay boy, just because I wore stripes. And I don't know, Breton stripes makes you gay, I guess. And so it was definitely very hard to separate that, especially growing up in 2000s where homophobia was just whatever, calling people gay just negatively was oh yeah, that's so gay, and all that subliminal messaging that was just very normalized, just I think just kind of tacked on to the fact that I just felt I didn't fit in, and it took me a long time to kind of be comfortable with this duality of being French and American, and sometimes one, sometimes more the other. I must have been I guess it was a few years ago when I became a citizen. I think it was 2021. Thing is, around the time where I was actually oh, I guess I'm a little bit of both and neither. I think becoming actively getting my American citizenship was almost this point where I passed it, and now it didn't matter to me because I was just kind of more comfortable with being neither and both. And it's funny because I think I've had the same experience with transitioning of after having bottom surgery, I feel so much more non-binary than before, even though there's no sense of what it means to feel that. But like, I think this general sense of like being put in this box, and then once you actually get in that box, you're like, oh no, like I'm very happy being outside of either box.
What encouraged you to get your US citizenship? Was it just to make things easier since you were working here and living here, or did you have a strong desire to like find a place that you could call home?
It's loaded, but I think there was definitely a logistical aspect. When I was in university in Canada, I had to come back at least every 6 months to keep my green card. And I had to show that I had been in the US for a continuous, I think it was like 3 years over the last 5 years. And so when I was going back and forth, I had to document all my trips. Like the like Department of Homeland Security gives you like 5 lines to talk about the countries you've lived and the times you've left the US. I had to print a whole sheet to add another like 20 or so lines of like, well, I went on this trip there. And like, for me, it was very trivial, just like seeing my family or like going back to DC, but all those things kind of adding up. And so it really became a logistical thing where my parents lost their green cards because they weren't able to come back enough to the US. And so there was a little bit of this like security of I can be American, come back here always. I think there's also the fact that just DC and like the US is home for me. And so really feeling like there was nothing that could quote unquote take me away from there. Like I know people have had their green cards for 40, 50 years and like nothing's going to happen, of course, but just I think this kind of more psychological like sense of safety, I would say.
I'd love to know a little bit more about your journey to figuring out your gender and sexuality, and also particularly if being an immigrant impacted that in any way, especially with like you talked a little bit about some of the like maybe stereotypes or things that people put on you when you moved to the United States.
It definitely linked for me, incredibly so. I think that the kind of struggle I had was that as an immigrant, as a French immigrant, there was this label of like gay being imposed on me, and I still to this day don't really identify with the whole like male loving side of things, and I never really did. So growing up, there's very much a sense, I think, when I was later in my teens, where I was probably not straight, but it wasn't really the comfort it gave me. And it wasn't the answer to all the questions I had. What I had been struggling with was more my gender. And so it almost like, the sexuality piece was almost like a red herring for me, because I was like, no, I'm pretty sure I'm mostly like women or like androgynous people. I didn't really come to the deconstruction of that gender until much later, where I went from like identifying as like heteroflexible to just being like, oh yeah, I'm bi, or some kind of bi umbrella term. And that was just through like a deconstruction of gender for me, where I was like, what does it mean to be like a man or a woman, and like that in between. So that was a little bit more of like, oh yeah, I guess I'm not straight. But at that point, I was just like, I don't care. Like it's trivial. And it wasn't like a big like coming out to myself of like, yay. It was just more of like, okay, that's not it. Like moving on down the list, like what else could it be? Until I realized that like it was gender. And so that's been incredibly interesting, because that being put in this box of like this like quote unquote metrosexual, like fashionable man into this like androgynous non-binary like trans feminine person was literally a mix of this like, I think European men have a lot more freedom with fashion, and a lot of gay men talk about like gaydar doesn't work in Europe. So I think there's a little bit of that like that duality to it. And yeah, I think it's very hard to separate the two, but for me, it was very much a sense that like sexually wasn't that big of a deal. Like I was very much used to like a lot of queer people in my life, but not on the gender side of the spectrum, just on like the like bi, lesbian, gay side of things.
It's been really interesting over the past couple of years. I think that conversations about gender have become more mainstream and have allowed people to explore that a lot more easily than they would have previously, when they were just built into these small boxes of, are you gay, are you straight, are you bi, are you lesbian? And so I think that hopefully as the conversation continues to become more mainstream and we all learn the vocabulary that we should know, hopefully it'll help a lot of people as they go through a journey similar to yours.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's also the power of like the reclaiming of the word queer
Mhm.
A lot of people now just like, I don't need to have this conversation explained to people. Like, I'm queer and that's fine. And I also like, I think there's a lot of layers to that because I use different labels to talk about myself. Like I
Mhm.
won't out myself as trans in a setting unless like, I feel like it's very obvious or it's kind of contextual. So I'll just say like she, her, like that's fine. I'm not gonna go out of my way to like put myself out as trans. But then if I know that I'm in a space where like I can talk about being non-binary, then I might just throw that in there. But I still feel like I have to explain to people that I'm trans feminine and non-binary. And it's very rare to find myself in a space where I can actually talk about gender identity and kind of like somewhere like using words like neutral or like agender or talking about like the fluidity and even just like for myself not entirely being sure what like my actual gender identity is within the non-binary umbrella.
Mhm.
Just kind of like being okay with that and like kind of figuring that as you go as well.
What are some of the terms that you wish more people knew,
Mm,
or that you wish could be a larger part of the conversation that people have?
yeah, I think there's maybe just like a sense that like non-binary is just this one androgynous thing in the middle. And I think there's so many more nuances that like it doesn't really have to look or be anything. I
Mhm.
think that's the beauty of it for me is like not feeling like I have to follow any rule book. It can be a little bit overwhelming as well. Like how am I going to be myself? Like how do I figure out like what that is? But like learning about those identities of like gender fluid or like neutral or like demi girl, demi boy, like there's so many interesting terms. And I think that if more people were presented to that, like not just boy, girl, or even boy, girl, non-binary, and understand like you can be like a kind of neutral boy or like a neutral girl. And that can look like someone completely different depending on like your gender assigned at birth or your culture or like so many things. And so I think that's what I think is the real like bummer is this lack of education really that like there's a rainbow of genders that like we're just not looking at.
It's beautiful. Yeah.
I love what you said about reclaiming the word queer, because I
Mhm.
also feel I feel that a lot where like sometimes I just don't want to explain like my own queerness. And so I can just say I am queer. And then it's sort of like you don't have to go into the detail with everybody. But there's also something really powerful about that word. And I love that it's sort of like this umbrella term that makes you feel like part of a broader community. My question for you is, as you were going through this journey of figuring yourself out, and then once you kind of freed yourself from the box of girl, boy, non-binary, how has that process been for you of like figuring out how you want to identify or what those words look like or any of those choices that you've made along the way with the freedom of not kind of falling into one of those boxes?
I mean, it's hard, right? Like I think especially when I came out as trans, I found this podcast called Enby that was incredibly helpful. It was a trans masculine person's experience. And I identified so much with their experience, but I also didn't know what it meant to be non-binary. It was kind of more of like one trans experience. And so I very much wanted a guide or some kind of sense of what that was. And it was also just easier for me to just be like trans femme and that's it, and not really go into details. As I've gone like more and more through my transition, I'm realizing like there's a lot of pressure to be hyper feminine as trans women, but whether it's to pass or whether it's just to like be affirmed, like different people like kind of do that differently. But I didn't want to feel this pressure of like, I have to pass. And I also felt like I'm at this point where like, what does it mean to pass? Like I'm tall, 6 feet, like kind of muscular and lean with broad shoulders. So like, depending on the setting, like people might look at me from the back and not see my pink hair and be like, oh, that's a guy. And like, I don't really care at this point. I'm like, I'm not going to go and like try to educate someone on like the gender spectrum. And like, frankly, they're not paying me for it. So why would I do it? But it's been incredibly helpful because now I'm finding myself with like, I do have this knowledge of these terms of, and I think whereas I place myself, I'm really kind of going more into details, is like somewhere between some kind of feminine identity and something neutral. It's also hard for me to separate my philosophy of gender that just like is very much like gender is BS and very performative and like incredibly socially constructed. And I think it has its place, but there's so much of it that's just rooted in sexism and just arbitrary rules. So
Yep.
it's hard for me to just be like, I align with like the rules that like society has put for women, because I don't. Like, we live in an incredibly gendered, sexist society, and that's just not where I would fall into that. But as far as my own experience, I do think I'm somewhere between like neutral agender and something feminine. And I don't know if that's in a gender fluid capacity or if that's in just kind of like a random kind of ineffable thing in between. But just kind of having these notions of like what that means and kind of just figuring it out also. And like, I think at the end of the day, like the label queer and non-binary are kind of just these great umbrella terms of just like, you don't have to go into more detail, because like, you'd have to talk to me, you know, like for an hour and get a sense of like, this is my experience of gender and this is my philosophy of it. And like, maybe then you'll get a glance of like what I think I know about myself.
And it's so interesting because it's truly such an individual journey for each person. And I think that there's this assumption that if you are exposed to the queer community as a young person, then it'll be easier for you to go through this journey as you get older. But I think, as you mentioned, you had a lot of queer people in your life growing up, but because you didn't necessarily fit into the boxes that they fit into, you still had to go on your own journey to find where you are now.
Yeah, absolutely. And also I think the role models I grew up around and the kind of gender presentation of like, my mom is an artist, very like colorful patterns, like a lot of colors, pattern on pattern, just different textures. And so like, I think nowadays might be like stereotyped into like this like queer aesthetic or this just kind of like artist persona. But for me, it just kind of broke these rules of gender. Like, you know, like maybe she was butching it up a little bit, but like, I didn't really see it that way. It's just like, she's wearing pants, you know, like, who cares? So it was very normalist in that way. And I have one older sister. And so like, I think just little things like learning how to sew, like these things were very much like normal for me. I was like, this is basic life skill. Like, you need to know how to sew. How could you not like fix your own like rip in your pants? And like, I came to all these like very gendered things without really realizing that they were that. And so my at-home environment wasn't heavily gendered. It was kind of when I went out into society and saw that. And that also happened a lot later. I think like in middle school, when I was younger, I didn't ask myself any of these questions. And I think it's really when puberty hit, which I think is a very common thing for a lot of trans kids, where like, I was really like, oh, like what is happening? Like not understanding like the relationship I had to my body and like this was confusing. And just not knowing what the words were to talk about it either.
And that's why I think vocabulary is so important.
Yeah.
And learning how to express yourself.
So the pandemic has been awful, but also I think also has been, I don't want to say like helpful, but has been like illuminating to a lot of queer people's journeys for different reasons, mine included. And I'm curious, I know that you've been transitioning during the pandemic. What has that been like for you? And like, how do you think that being in a pandemic has impacted that?
I mean, I think it really gave me the space to think of that. I like definitely think that if I hadn't had the pandemic, it would have been a year, 2, 3 years and like more therapy to like get to where I'm at now. But it really like not going to the office. Like I worked in an office that was like in financial tech. Like it wasn't like, it was very relaxed in terms of like the dress code and everything, but it was still like a pressure to show up and like be a little bit of a finance bro who also knows how to code. And that was just not for me. And so finding myself like fully remote, not really having to see anyone, not having to interact with anyone really allowed me to kind of not think of myself as like an external facing like mask or something. You know how like you got into society and you present, there's a little bit of a performance of like, this is who you are. I didn't have to do that. And so it's just all in my head. And it really gave me a lot of time to think of like, you know, I was like cross-dressing since I was like 9 or 10 and like just didn't realize that it had anything to do with gender. I just thought like, I didn't have any terms for it. So for me, it was very much just like, I don't know, maybe there's something wrong with me. I don't know. I never got a side of like, that is something that some kids explore. And finding myself during the pandemic of like, oh, maybe like I am like trans or something. Ask myself like a lot of these questions, reassessing like, I didn't know what dysphoria was. And for like people who don't know, dysphoria is the sense of like feeling out of touch with the gender you're assigned at birth. I didn't know that I was feeling a lot of dysphoria growing up, like around the disordered eating patterns and just toxic relationships with my body. And so it was at that point later, I was like, oh, that's why, like, that's why I feel such an adverse reaction to physical hair. Like, before even like fully, and I love this term, it's called egg cracking. We talk about it in the trans community of like, you've always been this egg and at one point it cracks and it hatches. I think there's a duality also of like, the butterfly, like going into cocoon, coming out. It's like, it's always been there and it's always been a butterfly, but like, we don't refer to it until like it's out. And yeah, once my egg cracked, I found myself like really able to ask myself these questions and really realize like, this relationship to my body, like the times that I'm happy, like we're just not when I was presenting this way. And we're very much just linked to like, I was at my friend's house, like freaking out for about 4 or 5 days. And she's studying psychology at the time. I pick up her DSM-5 to look at gender dysphoria. And I read the article, like the whole article in the DSM-5. And I like, quote unquote, self-diagnose myself and just be like, oh, why do I check every single box on this thing? Like, this is crazy. And so I came out like 4 or 5 days after that. And it's been also really great to not have to show up in person, be able to wear a mask, because then like laser hair like removal, like all the like treatments you do for like facial hair removal or make you bright red. And it's not the like most affirming thing as it's happening. So it was really nice to just be able to slap a mask on it and just kind of like forget about it. And like, I think it also kind of just gave me a lot of space to cocoon at home when there's no one else to see. And I think, like anyone going through puberty, you have this awkward phase, but when you're transitioning, like especially later in life, you're having your awkward phase, in your 20s, your 30s, your 40s, whenever you decide to transition. And that's a little bit weirder when you're an adult, you're working and like, you don't have as much freedom to have your fashion faux pas and to just like wear the stupid like hyper girly things or like hyper masculine things, whatever, like in every setting. And so it was kind of fun of like, buying like a dinosaur hair tie. Like that was fun for me, like I couldn't have done that before. And like just little things like that, that just like being at home gave me that space and not really feeling like I'd have to deal with anyone's gaze or like comments or snarky BS that you deal with.
It's interesting. I remember, and I hate to bring up Caitlyn Jenner for several reasons. I know she's highly controversial, but I remember when Caitlyn Jenner first came out and underwent her transition, a lot of the dialogue around her was how privileged she was to be able to do this basically in isolation. And I wonder if the pandemic offered people to some extent that ability to transition in a more secure environment that's less public.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I think, yeah, it normalized this notion of like not having to be like the video on or even just like wearing sweatpants every day. Like that meant something different for everyone else, but like I could have been wearing a dress at every meeting and no one would have known the difference. And so like there's definitely that aspect of it too. And I think also just the like, it's a very mentally taxing process to transition just because like there's family, there's friends, there's like maybe relationships involved. And so there's always this ongoing coming out process. And so I think just kind of having that like cocooning is just incredibly like just protective. Also something you mentioned about privilege is like, it wasn't until I transitioned that I realized how privileged I was in so many of these regards. And so I like to talk about this a little bit of like a level up. Like, I feel like the person I've become since I've transitioned has just like leveled up a lot in that like, I'm just more mature in my head and just have a much better grasp and more balanced like outlook on things. And so that's also been just illuminating just as a person to be like, more confident and like more in touch with my feelings, like other people's feelings, and just being more present in that way. And I think that a lot had to do with just being by myself, going crazy on my own a little bit until I could just like start from scratch a little bit.
I love that. I love that you were able to go through this process in a way that you felt really safe. I think that's super important for everyone.
Yeah, it's difficult. Like a lot of people don't have that luxury of like being in the safe space to transition. So incredible. And just turning back the question, I'm curious for the two of you, and Lauren, you mentioned explicitly, but your exploration as well of like your queerness, like in the pandemic, how has that been shaped for you by the isolation? And
yeah, I think TikTok had a lot to do with it. There's like a very large like lesbian community on TikTok, and a vast majority of my friends growing up are straight. And so I never really had a ton of exposure to, all different types of queerness, and in particular within the lesbian community. And so a lot of what I saw was more like what was represented in media. And as you said, in the 2000s, 2010s, that was not the best representation. And so seeing people dress in ways that I was like, I wish I could dress like that, or why don't I dress like that? Or, or just their confidence in sort of their own interpretation of gender, if you will, really like kind of gave me the confidence to do that myself and dress a little bit differently than I had before, and accept the fact, like, I think I associated a lot of things with more traditionally feminine, how the world would interpret as feminine style of dressing. So like I would never wear dresses, but when I went to a wedding, I wore a dress because I just thought that's what you were supposed to do if you identified as a woman. And then I realized I didn't have to do that. And now I don't see myself ever wearing a dress again because they just don't feel right for me. That's like not how I feel comfortable. And so I think that like having, even for myself, where I like haven't shifted a lot of the terminology I call myself, just the way that I express those things has been really helpful. And I think spending more time on social and connecting with people in a broader space, which is sort of antithetical to how I would think a pandemic would go, has been really helpful for me.
I think also having places like TikTok where this type of presentation and this type of dialogue is becoming more mainstream has also created easier spaces to shop to some degree, like a lot more inclusivity in sizes and cuts and types of clothing within mainstream stores that are more easily accessible has made things a little easier.
Yeah, and I think like there's been a rise in fashion lines and things like that are maybe styled a little bit more like gender neutral, but they have a good fit for different body types, like things like that, where I don't feel like I'm wearing clothes that don't fit me. I feel like I'm wearing clothes that I like that also fit my body. And that's like a really, I don't know, it feels really nice to like put things on that you feel really comfortable in and that feel like they fit you and all of those things. And I feel very lucky that like there was this time to sort of explore even just in the way that I dress. So yeah, I think the pandemic was super helpful for me in that regard.
That's really cool. I also had an experience where because I dressed kind of just more fashionably before transitioning, I kind of got rid of all my button ups because I was just like, I'm never going to wear these, like such a square, like there were hipster shirts, but just like, like I like the fabric and I would cut it out to make like a tote bag or something. That just felt a little bit too brutal. But I'm finding myself now like revisiting some of those tops, like paired with like something more feminine, and then the vice versa, or even just wearing a t-shirt. Like I have like a size A cup boobs, but like just wearing a button up and having like tiny little perky like Skittle nipples, as we call them in the queer community, because you take these like blue little Skittle size pills early on to transition. And like I just feel so much better just wearing a t-shirt differently now. Like, and it's part of it is just a huge like mental shift of just being confident wearing the same article of clothing. Another part of it is just that like taking hormones has literally made my head just work better and more confident. And I'm actually actualizing like myself into like who I feel like. I think just this sense of like, I used to look in the mirror and be like, who's that stranger? And now I'm like, you look good.
I love that.
Yeah, that's amazing. Oh,
so since we're on this topic of confidence, we know that you're dating. How has dating been going for you, especially during the pandemic?
It's good. It's interesting. I think it's really hard in terms of like being non-binary and like kind of defining that, because some apps have like really great gender like options, so much so that like it's like just pick one, and like one of the options will be like non-binary and the other one will be like trans feminine. I'm like, well, you can be both. And it's not really like having like too many options, and the opposite of just like fully binary of like they'll tell you like, oh, you're non-binary, but like do you want to be put into the men or women category? And I was like, that defeats the purpose. And so it's been interesting, but I know that like, and I haven't dealt with it personally. I think I present feminine enough, like for people not feel too like weirded out about me. But I know there's a lot of like just creepy guys that just like will match on you just to say terrible things.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, and I definitely see it on apps where like I guess I shouldn't name apps or anything, but like one app where like people will match with you first, and if you're a woman, you have to like match with them. And so I noticed this hack or bug, or I guess it's really a feature where like if you close the app and I switch my preference from women to men, the first result will usually be a man that's like swipe right on me. So I know like, oh wait, like whatever, like he's useless, whatever, but I know he's already matched on me. It's like a little hack I have. And I'll see like conservative Catholic, and I'm like, what? Like you just looked at my first photo and that was enough for you? But like I'll say like non-binary, pansexual, trans feminine, post-op. And it feels a little bit of a mouthful, but I think it's just like the way I protect myself from not having these conversations, or just like not having to run into those people. I predominantly have been dating like non-binary and like women. So it's, I think, just generally a safer space where like people are aware of like their place in society and how their gender like influences that at the very minimum. I think also there's, and I think in my personal experience, like just T4T, like trans for trans, like relationships have just been an incredibly just like safe space. And I think also like, I don't know how many like first dates anyone's had where they get to talk about something as personal and like profound as like their experience of gender and their identity in such a way. Like it's like this icebreaker that's immediately like there and immediately creates a safe space. So it's been really fun. It's been really rewarding. And it's also interesting in the like T4T space, there's this duality of like the gay hookup culture of like wanting to, you know, kiss all the boys, kiss everyone. And there's also this like duality of the lesbian side of things where like people are very emotional and very like upfront. Like, you know, one date, like some girl told me she loved me on the first date, and I was like, whoa, that's a lot. It was also like a 12-hour date. So like,
Wow.
you know, these are just the things that happen. But it's been a lot of fun just kind of like meeting people. And also I think we're in a place where COVID has kind of slowed down now. There's less stress around like COVID testing, but it does feel somewhat adjacent to like STI testing. Like, oh, like I had a like COVID scare, like let me get tested. And I think that's also really interesting because I think the queer community is incredibly good at that. Whereas like, I don't know that you'd see as much in the like, I don't want to make generalizations, but.
No, definitely. I definitely see that the queer community being a lot better at that than
I have to
straight community.
ask, what's your shortest lesbian date you've been on?
I think it was 4 hours.
Yeah, that's
I mean,
right.
I did have one that was like, I think 3 hours, but I think we're quickly like friends. Like it wasn't ever specified. We're just like hanging out. So I guess maybe 3, but like we friend zoned each other kind of. So I don't know. But yeah, that's just become a thing also. They're just mind blowing.
Yeah, I feel like that's very typical within the lesbian community. But I think the shortest lesbian date, well, the shortest date that with another woman that I've been on was I think 3 or 4 hours long, and neither of us were into it. Like it was very clear from the beginning of the date that neither of us wanted to be there, but it was still a very long date.
Yeah.
So funny. No one can end it.
Nope.
But I think there's also a duality of like, I mean, I am enjoying this person's company, you know, or like we could be friends, like, and so you kind of just keep going through that. And I don't know.
Yeah,
Maybe
for
it's
sure.
nice
I mean,
for your own good.
you can always find something to talk about.
Yeah.
So shifting gears a little bit, do you have any advice for people that are, you know, at the stage of sort of questioning their gender or starting to identify with gender dysphoria? What kind of advice would you give to folks in that position?
I'd be worried to give all encompassing advice, but
Sure.
I definitely like my experience and the way I approach it was like my dysphoria was very much just like intense and strong, and I basically address them a little bit, almost like medically, just as like symptoms I needed to address. Is like, I'm sad for this reason. Like removing hair from my legs is neutral. Like it's not a bad, it's neutral. It's like not even gendered. And it is something that will help me feel better. And so kind of just not shying away from the things that made me feel better. I do feel like, I think generally compared to other people, like I went through like several stages of my transition fairly quickly. I had facial feminization surgery, like I think 6 months or like 9 months after coming out, and like 3 months into hormones or so, because I knew it was never going to be covered by health insurance. And I was so privileged to have those savings already. So I just kind of did it because I was like, I'm going to want this at some point in the future. I don't know why I'm delaying it. And then I also, you have to be on hormones for a full year before you can start like anything for having bottom surgery. And so I was also very much on that kind of like just following that. And for me, it was just a question of like not shying away from the things I wanted, realizing like this was something that like I don't want to say struggled with, but I questioned my whole life. And so there was very much a like eureka moment. And like, it's, I think with transitioning, like time is like your biggest like enemy. Like you just gotta give it time. There's like some of the effects of like HRT, hormone replacement therapy, like take up to like 5 years to like fully show up. And so at the beginning, like I had a very obsessive, like taking a weekly photo of myself to kind of keep track of that. And then I was like, this is not helpful. This is just like putting more pressure on myself, and just start to do things that I like wanted to, the things that were fun. And so like I dyed my hair pink and I was like, this is awesome. I'm gonna keep doing it. Now I'm hooked. I did like 2 piercings, and then like I did like 4 and then 4 more. And so, like I think a really common thing that I've seen a lot of like trans people like do that like if very early on in the transition are just like these like small body modifications, whether it's a tattoo, a piercing, and like obviously the more like quote unquote invasive like surgeries are also great. But there's just like feeling like your body's your own and be able to reclaim it, like can be just like wearing a gold chain or like getting your ears pierced. And so really like acknowledging that those are like little things that can go a long way. Like I went to my best friend's wedding when I was still like presenting masculine, but I got my nails done. I was wearing mascara, and I was just like, I didn't like, it felt good. And like, I was wearing a suit, and like, everybody misgendered me. And like, I was not there to like have like headbutting with people. And like, that was not what I was like interested in, but it still like was my little thing of like they don't know my toes are bright red, but like it's still fun for me, and like I've got great lashes, why not put mascara on them, and so just falling into those things that are just easy and that are right there. And I think starting with that like allows you to kind of give this space for you to love yourself. Like I think not like before transitioning, it was very hard for me to feel this like notion of self-love and happiness in my body. And just letting myself do that by just being kinder to myself, I think in those ways, like really just was a huge unlock. And now like, I still have like quote unquote transition goals and like things I want to get to and etc. But like I wake up every day, I'm like just so like happy to be like where I'm at now, and like so appreciative of everything I have. And I think it's just given me like an outlook on life that just I didn't have before, just because I was just like didn't have self-love. And so yeah, I think just for me, transitioning was a process of like just finding self-love and like making sure that my body was my own, and really going about like doing the things that feel right.
I love that.
I would love to know, like, as you've during the pandemic and as you've gone through this whole process, where are like the pockets of the queer community that you found yourself in, or that you've found support in, or found safe spaces in?
It's interesting. I think I'm still trying to figure that out. But one thing that was really helpful for me is like DC has a huge trans community. I think it's like for a city its size, it's probably the like most trans city in the world. It's like 1 in 30 adults is trans in DC. And so there's several like resources and like support groups and different things like that. And so like those meetings can be a little bit heavy, just because like there's always like 1 or 2 people that are just like in crisis. But just being connected with that community has like opened up like events and like talking to someone who does like voice training therapy who's also trans and has like a similar experience as you, like you're getting a gender affirming care from someone who's been in that similar situation as you. So that's been like incredibly helpful. also DC, very great places like Whitman Walker, Planned Parenthood. Like you have a lot of these like kind of spaces that like I will say are under-resourced, understaffed, and like employees are underpaid. But like every single person you run into, like having like this beautiful non-binary like doctor come in and like help me with my issues is just like so affirming. And like I don't feel like I have to be like afraid of them or like, you know, like bring up like some kind of like medical thing that I might be like pushed back on, you know, like I had a like breast cancer scare. And so like I feel like as a trans woman, like going to a cis doctor would have been very like uncomfortable for me of just like being gaslit and like, no, you can't have it. Like I know my odds are lower, but like it runs in the family, like, you know, just get it checked out and be safe. But like being able to go to Whitman Walker and not have any questions about that and just get the help that I needed was just like such a weight off for something that like could be really dangerous to someone else, you know? So.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I feel like that's such an incredible thing to have, because I feel like so many of the like scary things that I hear about are people going to doctors that are not, you know, either part of the LGBT community themselves or trained enough in those spaces. I've been really excited that there's a lot more required training. I don't know if it's beyond DC, but the doctors that I have in DC have talked about like how much more training around or a specialization around working with folks within the LGBTQ plus community they've gotten over the past few years. And that's so exciting, because I feel like that is still like a really hard part of being queer. There's like even like little things, like I remember, when I had cancer a couple years ago, and every single time I went in, I had to, for almost anything, I had to take a pregnancy test. And I was like, I'm in a very committed, like, lesbian relationship. Like, there's no chance of me being pregnant, but I still had to do it every time because it's just protocol. Which, like, whatever, it's not a big deal. I peed in a cup 12 times instead of 0. And not like really didn't change my like day to day, but it's still just like those little things. Like I'm waiting for them to acknowledge it. And then I think there's also like the obviously much bigger things that people deal with. And so I'm like optimistic that in like cities like DC or cities that have a larger queer community, that will continue to get better, but it's still obviously so bad in certain parts of the country.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like a similar like anecdotal example is like I went to that mammogram and the nurse asked me like, when was the date of your last menstruation? In my head, I'm thinking like, this is the funniest thing you've ever said to me today. And I'm like, oh wait, she's serious. Because in my head, I'm like, oh, first she didn't clock me, like what? And then second, like she's asked me like when my last period was, and like, oh, that. So I told her and she's like, oh, you're my first trans patient, welcome. And like, it was very nice and like harmless, but also just a little bit of a weird thing, like welcome, like this isn't that special at the same time.
Yeah, I feel like the medical community, I have also been excited as we've gone through starting a family, seeing a lot of doctors who openly say that they are queer inclusive. However, I will say that I think a lot of the forms and stuff need a bit of an update. A lot of the forms that Lauren specifically had to fill out were assuming that she was male.
Mm-hmm.
Well, or no, I mean, like, too. So when we started going through fertility treatment, I had to fill out, because I like identify as a woman, I had to fill out the same forms as Caitlin. So the form for like a male partner was like one sheet that was like, have you done XYZ, like check consent, whatever. The forms for me, I had to fill out like 40 pages of forms, like about my like last menstruation and like all of this stuff. And I wasn't going through any of the fertility processes. They just didn't have a form for like non-binary people or like a female partner. And so it was, I mean, it, you know, again, like at the end of the day, it was like an extra hour and a half of my time, but it was still like, I was like, can you just change like literally the gender question on this like male partner form and like call it a day? Like, it feels like it would take them like 2 minutes in a Word document. If
you're going to hold yourself out to being supportive of the LGBTQIA+ community, and and hold yourself out to being a resource to them, I think you need to consider all of the steps that lead up to
Absolutely.
actually meeting with a doctor and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so I froze my sperm before I started hormones just to have that option in the future. And I also anticipate like the form in the future, if I'm with like a cis like woman, or even like with a trans man, like having a kid, like who's going to be in what box, like what, like there, I can't imagine they've thought about that, or they have an elegant way of like putting that. Even birth certificates, like I guess I would be listed as the father, but like it's just a fundamentally just like flawed and sexist like view to the whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I actually don't know, because we've done a lot of research into birth certificates and all of the things that we need to do to make sure that both of our rights are protected. But I don't know in DC what they list them as. Like parents, like is it parent 1, parent 2, or is it?
It depends. I was reading about this. I think it depends on the state.
Right.
I think in some states it says like it has gendered parents, but and I think in DC it's parent 1, parent 2, which is at least a little better.
DC is actually impressively good around a lot of the like documentation things. Like changing name is difficult, but you can change your gender marker with no, like nothing. You just show up and you tell them X, Y, F. And so it was very shocking for me because I had moved early on in my transition, and I had this option to change my gender marker. And I was like, I still felt weird because like I looked masculine. So it felt like I'd be like trans mask or something if I put the different, I just felt weird. I also don't love the whole idea of like having an X on your documentation, just because like for me, they're like, it's just get rid of the gender field. Like don't just like,
Yeah.
who cares about what's like, because right now really it's the way it's written, and like they talk about gender, but they ask about sex. Like that's what like male and female really means. So
Right.
already that's just like the first thing of like, just write it as what it is if you want to be like quote unquote biologically correct, if that's their argument, or just like, I don't know, it just feels like a whole weird thing. But to me, to be like non-binary, I still would probably put just F like once I do that, because it just feels like a safer thing. Like I'm showing my ID, I don't want to out myself as like a trans person just because I'm non-binary. Like it's going to be explicit. There's also like the context of like what the X means depending where you go. Like in India, typically it might mean that you're Hijra, which is this like third sex, which is, I think, as far as I understand it, always assigned male at birth, trans feminine folks. And that's not necessarily the experience for a lot of non-binary people like that want the X on their like identification. So yeah, I digress, but
No, it's a good point though. Do you have any other questions that you wish we would ask?
I think there's a funny notion to the notion of like being straight, I think, in the side of queer dating. Like I don't like dating men. For me has just been this really weird thing of like most like apps like don't necessarily like give me the option to filter by like people who identify as bi or pan or something. So I always feel like if a cis, like someone who identifies as cis het like man were to like be with me, I'd have to tell them that like they're bi at the very least because they're attracted to another gender. And so that also has just been an extra layer for me where I'm just like really skeptical about like how to navigate that. And I still haven't quite figured that out.
Would you feel comfortable dating someone who identifies as cis het?
I don't know, you know, like if it's in this like, if it's in this not oppressive like way of just like attracted to like femininity and like et cetera, and that's like what they're attracted to in me, and like I guess that's fine. But I think there's also this assumption or like, or maybe not assumption, this understanding that for me they'd have to have that like I might look more masculine than them some days. I don't know that like I think some people like are perfectly comfortable with that, you know, like there's cis women who have like buzz heads and like, you know, present in more androgynous ways, but perfectly identified like cis women. And so I think that like there is room for that. But because I find myself in this kind of like awkward bucket of like being undeniably trans, it's very delicate and I haven't quite figured it out. I'm kind of going as a person by person basis for now.
I think that's fair.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like going on a person by person basis is a great way to approach dating anyway. And I feel like there's just like, I don't know, there's something like you said about when you're dating T for T, there's something about like having those deeper conversations earlier on that I think can like kind of help you figure out if you are a good match for someone quicker. Like it adds a little of intensity to the first date for sure, or like a second date. But I also think that like a common problem I see a lot of my like straight girlfriends fall into is like they're dating someone for a couple of months and then they realize that the person they're dating is like an asshole in like a bunch of other, you know, things that they just like never talked about because they spent their first dates talking about like which bars and restaurants they like to go to and like things like that, which is, you know, obviously great first date conversation. But I think there's something kind of great about knowing, like having to have some of those conversations earlier on that lead to other, you know, other serious conversations, help you figure out how you connect with the person in a deeper level.
Absolutely. And I think that like we can joke about the 4 to 12-hour dates all we want, but there's a little bit of like packing in the first, second, and third date in that.
Yeah,
For sure.
absolutely.
And that's why lesbians are known for U-hauling, because we just pack so much into such a truncated period of time.
I think also there's a weird side to like dating as a like trans, like dating straight men as a trans woman, is that like chasers, like cishet typically guys who are just very like fetishly so into trans women. And so depending which app you go on, like if it's a more hookup culture app, like you're obviously gonna like run into a lot of those. But it just blows my mind that like there's guys on Grindr that are just cishet, just out there looking for like trans women to just be weird around. And so that's also just like another side of like straight dating that I'm just like not super comfortable with.
That's so fascinating. Did you call them chasers?
Chasers, yeah. And even within there's like a whole other side of it where like some of them are like very not into like post-op trans women. And that's also just a whole other layer of that just like blows my mind of like just being into trans women. I mean, chicks with dicks are great, like I'm all for it, but this notion of like being into them just for that just feels textbook fetishy, and I just don't know how to like break out of that.
Yeah. What, if you're comfortable saying it, like are there apps that you felt most comfortable on or that have been the best experience for you?
There's definitely, so I have this thing like about this lesbian dating app that I use, which I think is great, but you get so many matches, and then maybe it's because like there's a lot of subs and switches in the like lesbian community. I don't know, but like no one takes the first step. And so to have to like always be the one starting, it's just like, no, this is too much. But then you always want someone else to start, and no one talks first. And then like if there's no message sent between the like I think first day or something, like the app will automatically say like, let's get this party started. And I'm just like, okay, nobody sends another message. But so that's been, I think, like a good platform though, like lesbian apps have been good. I don't, should I say names of apps? Like, is that a weird thing or?
You can. I mean,
Okay.
there's no pressure to, but.
Okay, because that one's Her, which I think has been good for that. I've also liked Bumble, just because like I get to see like if they're conservative or something like before they matched with me. So I get this extra filter of just like, yeah, let me see. I recently got on Hinge, but it feels a little too like heteronormative, even in its like queer like dating app side of things of like, I just feel like I'm committing to a lot something immediately. I don't know why. It's just, maybe it's just a mental block and I just need to like talk to more people.
We're going to be interviewing the CEO of Her. So I'm excited that you even it's probably a really common problem that they have to deal with, which is probably why they built that feature of like, hey, let's go.
So while we're on the topic of Her, I think another comical thing around the U-hauling thing is like getting matches from like more than 100 miles away.
That's
the
crazy.
one thing. I'm just like, I don't have a car. Like, if I can't bike to you, like, I'm not seeing you.
That's so I think that we met on Tinder, and Tinder was the only app that I used, and I think I had it set so that if you were more than like 40 miles, we could not match.
I think I had it lower. I think I had it like to 10 or 20.
Really? Well, you didn't have a car.
I didn't have
I
a
had
car. Yeah. I was like, I can't drive to like, and I still matched with some people who were like in Reston. I was like, I can't get to you. Yeah, I think that the setup for like the assumption that like LDRs are like long distance relationships are like totally fine and like everyone wants them is so funny. Yeah, what are you supposed to do with it? Like, how can you, that's not, yeah.
Yeah,
Like,
I mean, I'm just like, it doesn't matter if you're cute now. Like, I'm sorry. Like, I don't need another pen pal.
well, okay, so I want to ask our final question, which is, how are you a happy queer adult?
I mean, in every way, I guess. I think for me, like, being like a happy queer adult has literally just been getting to this place in my life where like I can wake up in the morning and like look at myself in the mirror and feel happy and like feel bubbly and like have this self-love and this appreciation for myself. And like I still have like outfit anxiety, which like I thought was just a trans thing before, but I think I'm just indecisive and I can't pick an outfit. But like, yeah, just feeling confident and feeling like I truly don't care about like what else is happening in the world, like around me. Like obviously I do care about what's happening in the world, but I'm very much living in my own world. And I mean that in the best of way of like just doing what works for me, what makes me happy. And I've been less of a people pleaser in like a good way. And I've done just more of the things that just like fulfill me. Getting back to like hobbies that I either thought like I was never allowed to do, like just because they were gendered, like crochet. I started doing crochet and now I'm like making these little penguins, adorable. Can't make enough time for it, but absolutely cute. Like even things like I've always wanted to roller skate and like haven't ordered them yet. I have a lot of hobbies on my list to get to, but like just being able to do those things and also getting back to the things that like I think I was maybe a little bit like resistant to because they were so like masculine that like I just like, I did rugby for like some time because like I felt like I needed to be part of the boys or whatever. And now like I would love to play rugby again. Like I think having that change of mindset of like this wasn't bad because it was gendered, it was bad because the gender piece of it didn't work for me. And as far as like the like because the duality of the queerness, like not just the identity, but the like romantic aspect for me, like I think also it's just been like great to just meet people that are in a similar headspace. I think that like with all the queer folks I've met, like just the emotional and mental maturity, like it's just you can't like give it 5 years maybe on like other people that are cis. I don't want to like slap them down like that, but like really there is this like sense of like for someone who's like taking time to like assess like who they are, and like what and who they love and like really pursuing those things. And that's been really great for me.
So happy to hear that.
I know.
Thank you so much. Anything you want to like share how people can follow you? Anything you want to promote?
I'm a pretty private person, so nothing personal, but as far as like organizations to support and things that I just can't say enough love, Planned Parenthood, Whitman Walker, both have really great like things for transitioning. Especially Planned Parenthood, I don't think people really know that side to them, but great resources for trans folks. And then just, I think for people who are questioning, reaching like looking for help or anything, advice, like social media, like you said, is a really great person. Like there's a couple influencers that I follow. Madison Berner is one on Instagram. She's just fantastic trans woman. Matt, is it XV?
XIV. Yeah,
yeah.
I found you.
Yeah, and like they do like really great things, the two of them, and just like following that. There's also a publication called Them, which also is just really great, just like Enby and like queer like centric. So I kind of just get like uplifting news from there too, like queer stories. It's nice to see the duality, not just the like hard things. Yeah.
I'm so glad you mentioned them. Madison and Matt are two of my favorite folks that I follow. So that's very exciting.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time. I had a blast chatting with you, so really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a delight to be here.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Happy Queer Adults.
Our music is by Kevin Burke at Kevin Burke Music, and our artwork is by Mike O'Brien at Red Table Press.
We are releasing new episodes the first Wednesday of each month.
If you have an LGBT Q&A for us, please submit them to happyqueeradults@gmail.com or send us a DM on Instagram.
You can find us at happyqueeradults.com or at happyqueeradults on Instagram and TikTok, and happyqueerpod on Twitter.
You can watch full episodes of our show on YouTube, as well as listen on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
If you liked what you heard and want more content from us, please leave a 5-star review.
Again, thank you so much for listening, and have a very happy, very queer day.